I'm going to give it a moment because people will be joining, and then there will be an awkward silence, but it's okay because people will be signing in, so we'll give them a moment. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. We are going to wait a little bit as people join here, so I'll give it just a minute, then we can get started. Once again, good morning, good afternoon, and we want to welcome you to our second Ubuntu Dialogues webinar for the 2022 calendar year. My name is McCoy-Deh, and I'm the project manager for Ubuntu Dialogues at Michigan State University. We want to welcome back those who have been attending our Ubuntu Dialogues webinars before. We also want to extend a very special welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. As I am sure that most of you know by now, Ubuntu Dialogues is a partnership between the African Studies Center at Michigan State University and the Stellenbosch University Museum at Stellenbosch University. And it is funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We want to recognize the Ubuntu Dialogues team. I see that some of them are in the room already. Bongani Mgijima and Mariki Olofsson, Natasha Coltman from Stellenbosch, then Jamie Monson and Beza Desta at Michigan State University. Thank you for all the work you do to make this program run as smoothly as it has been in the past and moving forward, I hope. To learn a little more about the program, including some of our upcoming events, we invite you to check out our newly launched website, and I'm going to put a link in the chat box in a little bit once I have a moment, but I will share that with you. I want to transition now to introduce our speakers. We do have two speakers for the session today. The first speaker is Dwanyen, and she is currently a Dean's Research Associate in the College of Social Science and the Department of Human Development and Family Studies at Michigan State University. Our second speaker is Marcella McCoy-Deh, Director of the Philadelphia University Honors Institute and Associate Professor of American Studies at Thomas Jefferson University. I have told our speakers that I'm not going to say more beyond what I've said now. If they have anything else they would like to share, they will do that during their remarks. I also want to introduce the discussant for our session, Edem Adotey, a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. Thank you for joining us, and we are so much looking forward to hearing from you this morning, this afternoon. Then in terms of the structure for the webinar, the speakers each will have under 10 minutes, not more than 10 minutes, to give us their opening remarks. And then the respondent will take 5 to 10 minutes to respond. And then I will facilitate a conversation for about 40 or so minutes. And then I will circle back to our presenters for their final thoughts in the last 10 or so minutes. We are trying to set this up as a conversation. And for that reason, we have really asked our presenters to keep their opening remarks short, and then most of the other things that they really want to share will come out of the conversation we are going to have. We also want to invite you to put your general comments in the chat box. If you have questions during the question and answer sessions, we are going to ask you to put them in the question and answer chat box. One other thing we are going to do in the spirit of conversation is during Lekki's presentation, Lekki is going to go first. While she's doing her presentation, I'm going to put a prompt in the chat box so that you can also engage with what she is talking about, but also pull into your own experiences to get us to talk to each other during this conversation. And then the same thing I would do, put a chat box in the chat box, a prompt that's related to the presentation that Marcella is going to do. And then you can also engage with all of us in the chat box so that there's an ongoing conversation there as well. So again, welcome. We are so much looking forward to sharing these moments together as we converse around Lekki and Marcella's work. To get us off here, I'm going to hand over time to Lekki to start and to have 10 minutes or less to do that. Over to you, Lekki.
Thank you, Pinyo, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining all of us here at Ubuntu Dialogues this morning. As Pinyo said, my name is Dr. Lekki Dwanyen. I am currently a research associate in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies at Michigan State. I want to back up though and just give a little bit more about who I am. My born name is Lekpoh Dwanyen, and Lekpoh means to inquire. And so I very much hold true to my name in passion and in work. I am an inquirer and have been since I was born. I was actually born in Liberia, but I'm also a child of the Ivory Coast, and I consider myself a child of Africa as a continent. I am also a child of Minnesota, USA, and really a transnational child. And that is all rooted in my early childhood experiences in the Liberian Civil War. So I'll give a little bit more about that as I talk, but in essence, I'm a child of nation-state conflict, of forced migration, of transnational adjustments and cultural strengths. I'm a child of community resilience, a child of justice seekers and peacemakers. And I try to tie all of this into my work with folks who are impacted by civil wars. So currently, as I mentioned, I'm a deemed research associate, but I'll be transitioning to the assistant professor tenure track system in HDFS in the fall. And my work focuses on addressing traumatic stress with folks who have experienced civil wars. And I do this work with both refugee families who resettle to the US and families who have remained in post-conflict settings. So when we talk about displacement, I found myself working with Liberian refugees in the Midwest in one of the largest resettlement areas for Liberians in the United States. And that work involved understanding from the community's perspective drawing in perspectives from local leaders and community members through focus groups and interviews. I wanted to understand how they were observing mental health and family health in the community almost 20 years after we had a mass migration, mass resettlement to the US because of our Civil War. My work in post-conflict settings has primarily been in Uganda, and Uganda is also a place that has been affected by more than a decade of civil war. And so there, I want to understand how can we strengthen the mental health system that is present, already existing in the country, using and relying on and being in relationship with the people, the resources, the knowledges, the wisdoms, and the capital that already exists in Uganda to strengthen the national mental health system, right? And so there's a heavy reliance on psychiatrists right now, on medications, and in my training and my background and in my beliefs and my passions, I understand mental health to be relational. I believe that I am healthy because we are healthy. We are healthy because we are in healthy relationships. I believe that health is not just individual, but it is a family concept, it's a community concept. And so how can we also engage family and community and relationships in healing when it comes to mental health and take on a different approach than we've seen in our Western models of mental health. The last thing I'll just say is that I'm very invested in, I told you I'm a child of justice seekers and peacemakers. And so one of my passions is political responses to systemic issues, right? And so my work has also engaged Liberian women who were engaged in political resistance efforts and eventually ended 14 years of civil war in our country through protests, strikes, marches, rallies, and strategies alike. So I take on a very feminist, transnational feminist approach in that work to understand how women have succeeded in combating violence and civil war, but rebuilding peace in an entire nation state. So thank you for being here. I am so excited to just be in conversation with Marcella and be in conversation with you all as much as possible.
Thank you so much, Lekki, for your opening remarks. I'm going to repost the prompt as we go ahead. Feel free to, any one of us who is comfortable, and again, don't feel like you have to, but if you are comfortable, we would love to hear from you in terms of some of your own experiences and in engagements with displacement or with belonging. Feel free to share as we continue. And right now, we want to give over time to Marcella. And as Marcella speaks as well, I'm going to post a prompt related to some of the issues she's going to bring up in her presentation. Marcella, over to you.
Thank you, and good morning. And again, thank you for the invitation. It is my honor, my pleasure to be with you this morning. I want to open by telling you a little bit about my background and my path, and then into how my work impacts me personally, or the personal feature of my work, and then the professional, how I weave it into my professional output. Let's see. As an African-American, I've always been curious about why being Black was so bad, okay, in American culture. So it began, I'm going to start around graduate school, and I arrived at this really interesting, I thought intriguing dissertation topic, but then felt discouraged about it because I was asked, where is that going to go? Why is that important? But I thought it was significant when someone says to you, you need to be the expert on this little slice of knowledge, you have to contribute something to the scholarship. I thought I found something obscure that I certainly noticed, and then was discouraged because I was told it was invalid, and it was the slice of African-American popular culture. And that's where I lived, that's where I was comfortable, and that's what I wanted to investigate, and so I did. One of the things that frustrated me around that was there were always parallels, but I could identify parallels, but I couldn't identify a line, any historiography, and that was missing due to the nature of how African Americans came to be. So I spent a lot of time in graduate school reconnecting. As part of my graduate assistantship, I had to set up I set up these dialogues with the African American students and the African students, just to talk about some really basic but complex institutions on both ends, just trying to understand why we didn't understand each other, why in some cases we didn't like each other, were afraid of each other, and just didn't really know enough. We just didn't know enough, but we were obviously, had common connection, had common roots. I forged friendships, and there was some geography involved, traveling in some cases where I could, just to help de-romanticize the great expectation that a lot of African Americans have about Africa, and the mythology around who we were before the transatlantic trade. But really, I went about understanding the impact of colonization on Africans, in addition to what I'd already understood about the impact of slavery, and then started connecting the dots. There were very persistent and obvious traits around cuisine, folkways, language, and then of course embracing the undeniable and what was seen as undesirable, things like our skin, our hair, and that's a whole conversation there. And then learning who we really were, who we were really, and what happened actually, not depending on the lore, because there was very little information, no African history courses, nothing, that was accessible to me in the 80s and early 90s, in my general, life outside of starting to dig myself. So personally, I set about a research agenda that was personal, but it was clearly also professional, around affirming the African identity as an African American, like affirming that identity. And what that meant for me was I felt like I had to start from the inside out. So deconstructing some myths that have been spun in American culture about around all the negativity. So, you couldn't be beautiful if your skin was too black. You couldn't be beautiful unless your hair was straight. Your features couldn't be too full. Your speech must be crisp. Your skin must not be so dark. Okay. So I didn't fit any of that. And a lot of people I knew did, and a lot of people I did. And there's this whole politic of color consciousness that was just, damaging and destructive. Again, it reinforced this idea that nothing good comes from Africa, just war, poverty, depravity, which was, of course, untrue. Upon talking about visiting West Africa for the first time, I was met with questions from people who I understood to be, academics, to medical doctors, to just, people that I knew. And they asked me, do you know the language? Is it safe? And I'm thinking, okay, I will eat what the people eat there. I will speak, okay. Yes, so the other pieces, and then moving along outside of the aesthetic, self-expression. I learned to love my hair. I learned as a young professional at a conservative, historically Black university that, I was going to wear my hair without chemicals. And students were like, is that okay? Or when I graduate, should I straighten my hair? And I said, that's up to you. I understand where that comes from. So I'm not going to vilify you for your choices, but it is your choice. And you do what makes you feel most confident. And then as an administrator at a small private, predominantly white college, being met with, what is she doing with her hair today? Nobody would say it, but I saw the looks, I heard some of the whispers, and, it's just, I couldn't, I just had to be very, internal in my expression and stand tall in it. I remember meeting a South African physician, and with my daughter, and she looked at my daughter's hair and said, "Oh, her hair is like ours." I said, "It's the same hair." And she was perplexed because she said, "Can you wear your hair natural to work? You're a professor. Is that okay?" And I said, "Absolutely. And you can too as a medical doctor." So even in these spaces where people are highly accomplished, identity affirmation can impede or present these roadblocks or at the very least questions. So other things, even hosting people in my home, and I have a lot of Black artwork, and someone said, you must love yourself some Black people." So, well, I sure do. I just oughta, and not recognizing that other Black people were hesitant and resistant to express love, acceptability, to affirm themselves. And then it got kind of high stakes. I dared to marry an African. This is what she married an African. My daughter has a traditional name from his traditional language. And, I was met with resistance. I got special phone calls from family members who said, "You might want to reconsider that. What are people going to say? We've seen all the literature around names and jobs." And I said, "No, her name has 3 syllables. My name has 3 syllables. You will learn it. You will say it. She will not have a nickname. She will not shorten it." So at 5 years old, I authored a children's book with the title of her name. She was very proud of it. And she would easily say to anyone, "This is my name." She'll spell it for you. And that's no short name, no middle name. You use her name. And then ultimately, as she entered first grade, I remember her first grade teacher showing me something, and they had to say, "Who's the most important person to you?" And she had this picture of this Black man with long hair. And the teacher said, "Look at this." And she said, "This is God. And I said, we don't have any images of God in our home, but she envisioned God as Black. I didn't tell her that. Our church really just has crosses. It didn't have that. And I was so happy because that certainly was not the personification of God that I grew up with or that I even struggle with today. And then finally, if I'm still in time, centering African values in my professional pursuits. So just as my daughter, I was so adamant with her, and I guess had the fortitude to proceed with her naming and standing by it, was in my classes over the years. I'm primarily an administrator now for the past 15, 20 years, but I still teach some courses. And oftentimes we have international students with traditional names. They will often say, "But call me this, call me Sarah, call me Jennifer, call me, Mark." And I'm like, that's not the name I see here. And I didn't always know how to say it, but I said, "Tell me your name. I'm going to ask you a few times because I need to hear it. And I'm going to look at it while I listen to it because I'm going to learn how to say it. And you insist that people learn your name. That is your name." And so I just had to model that use of that's your primary. It's the first thing you're given, is your name. And you do need to require others to learn it. Finally, in my scholarship, I do creative writing as well as scholarly writing. And the novel I wrote talks about a young professional professor, and it's co-authored with with a colleague who's also in higher education. And it's kind of a coming of age where she learns that in order to walk in her fullness professionally, she realizes that she finds that the scholarship of African women becomes very important to her emotional healing, her psychological healing, and that we're all in this together. And that is what ends up helping her thrive, not all of these other aspirations that she had. And then finally, my Fulbright year at the Institute of African Studies, at the Kwame Nkrumah Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. One of my biggest takeaways was the decolonization of African scholarship. It was in every seminar I attended, and the syllabus, it was a glaring issue in the syllabi that I had access to. And so one of my big questions was, wow, we need a resource, we need a place for this material that isn't getting circulated in the West, some that isn't even published in some of the major databases, it's not accessible. So I came up with this idea of a repository for those works so that African studies scholars or scholars of Africa can access so much of this really intriguing, really important scholarship that we don't have access to. We don't even know it exists unless you know where to find the paper. And I think that's what spurred my invitation today. So thank you. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Marcella. We want to move on now to our respondent. And I'm going to also post a prompt for those who are comfortable sharing that's connected to the respondent's remarks. And once we are done with the respondent's remarks, I'm going to repost all the 3 prompts so that they can be part of the conversation we are going to have here in a moment. So, Dr. Adotey, over to you.
Okay, so good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. Thanks so much for this opportunity to be part of this wonderful discussion. So I am a senior research fellow at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. I'm a historian, and my work primarily looks at the borderlands, African borderlands. And basically, my work is looking at the communities that have been divided by the borders. And I'm sure most of you know that that is a pretty common phenomenon across the continent, where the inherited colonial borders have divided several ethnic groups and communities. So my work tries to look at how these communities respond to these boundaries. And again, it basically speaks to the issues of community and identity that Lekpoh and Marcella have raised. So that is basically what I do. So some of the issues I've looked at have got to do with the chieftaincy institution, which is a very important traditional institution, which again speaks to the whole Ubuntu issues we'll be looking at today. And I've looked at how communities that have been separated by their boundaries respond to or relate to their chiefs on the other side. And what that again means for identity construction, because in Ghana, for instance, since a return to democratic rule, we've had issues of what we call cross-border voting. And the issue has been that there's a belief that largely and then basically I focus on the West-speaking community. And there's a belief that they cross over from Togo, and they are being separated by the Ghana-Togo boundary. So they cross and vote for one of the other parties who is believed to be another party, in quotes. So some of these issues, so things as issues like that look very cultural, as very contemporary overtones in our political setup, and some of these issues are what I look at. So basically that is what I do. So back to the conversation that we're having today. I really like what Lekpoh and Marcella have raised so far. I'm really fascinated about the issues they've raised regarding identity and community. And I think these two issues speak to each other, because when we're talking about community, we're basically also talking about identity, and especially with the issues Lekpoh raised regarding how she approaches mental health, which is what I believe Ubuntu is about, which is going back to our roots and looking to African-made solutions to our problems. And again, that is also tied in with Marcella's issues about identity. If we're talking about African identity, what is it that we're looking at? So both of them basically are talking about going back to our roots, which is a concept that is familiar in Ghana, what we call Sankofa. I'm sure probably some of you have seen the bird, but moving forward with the head turns backwards, which basically is saying that to move forward, you need to look to your past to understand where you're going. So these two issues of community and identity speaks to the issue about history. How much do we know about ourselves? How much do we know about our communities? And what lessons can we tease out from these spaces to address some of the contemporary challenges that we are confronted with? So for instance, Marcella raised the issues about identity and what it means to be an African. You may be surprised to find that in Ghana, as a result of colonial rule, we also experience the same identity crisis. The issues we raised about names, it's the same. Whilst growing up, even in school, we weren't allowed to speak what they call vernacular languages. We were basically compelled to speak English. Even our local issues, we were punished for not using vocabulary to eat this locally. So we also have issues of identity that you speak about. So these issues of identity speak to what it is that we know about ourselves. How much do we know about ourselves, and how do we go back and excavate some of these histories and our contributions to development. But then the two issues you raise also raises issues as a historian that I think we need to grapple with. Because when we talk about identity and we talk about community, my worry sometimes is that these things are not historicized. Identities and issues about identity constructions are not static. They change over a period. The same person might see himself as a part of one particular community, but the next minute, he sees himself as a person who belongs to another community. And this is very important because we're looking at historical issues. In the case of Lekki, we're talking about civil wars. And if we are talking about a community where we're talking about Ubuntu, what we say that an African way of life, it's about humanness, it's about love, it's about respect. Why should we have such instances where people who live in the same communities will be taking up arms against each other? When does one become the other so that it's okay to dehumanize him or her? So once we try to historicize some of these issues, we might want to be a bit more nuanced about how we talk about some of these things, because sometimes we say that it's the African way of life, but we live the same way, in the same manner over time. And again, it also speaks to the same issues about the African identity that Marcella also raised. What about the role of the African leadership or even individuals in the transatlantic slave trade? What again does that mean for this whole Pan-African project of seeing ourselves as one people in quote? So that if we're talking about Pan-Africanism, we're saying that the destinies of those on the continent and those in the diaspora are intertwined. What do these historical instances where there's a clear division between what belongs here, who belongs there, who belongs wherever, have clearly shown that there's sometimes there are fault lines when it comes to some of these issues. So what I would say is that yes, these are very important issues that we need to address. The Ubuntu philosophy is a very important one. The independentness, the community, identity, these are very important issues as we try to move our peoples forward in the 21st century. But we also need to historicize some of these concepts so we are able to grapple with some of the challenges that might confront us as we try to apply these concepts in our lives and personal lives and professional lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adotey. We are going to transition to our conversation portion. And the way we are going to do it, there's two options. Feel free to use the question and answer box for your comments and questions. But if you also would rather speak, you can indicate by raising your hand icon, and then I can unmute you and give you the space to speak. I would just ask that if you have the floor, let's make it really short. If you have a chance to speak, I think let's keep all our comments under 1 minute so that we can all get a chance. It will be really, really wonderful to hear from as many people as possible in the audience. So right now, let's do that. I'm going to take any hands. If I show you can show by raising your hand, and then I will unmute you and give you the chance. Otherwise, you can also use the question and answer box to do that. As we prepare to come in with our remarks, maybe Lekki and Marcella, you wanted to respond briefly to the comments from Dr. Adotey, and then we'll go to the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Adotey. very, very insightful connections between Marcella and I's work, which draws on so much connection between identity and mental health and belonging. I completely think that mental health and identity are in conversation with each other consistently. A healthy part of having a positive sense of self, a positive sense of who I am, where I come from, where my family's roots and ties are, our history, our community history. We've seen work over and over, and work by Black psychologists affirm that the closer we are to a sense of identity, culture, and belongingness, the closer we are to a sense of mental health. And so I am, just resonating with the connections that you made and with the connections between Marcella and I's work. So thank you.
Yes, in response, thank you, Dr. Adotey, for your comments. And it's very tricky because identity can be fluid. And it's complicated, right? So there's no idyllic space, right? So this idea of, complicity, and this came up when I was in Ghana, it comes up here. You have some people who are angry with Africans and say, I don't want to go, they sold us, and then I want nothing to do with them. And then others who, have this very romantic view. And I think we were all of that. And how do we move forward? I think we have to start by learning about it, acknowledging all of it. And, I'm not sure, I don't have an answer for what can be done. It's not something that we get over, it's something that we learn from and understand. So what is that place? You have a lot of African Americans saying, oh, I'm going to move, after the year of return in Ghana in 2020, I'm gonna move to Ghana. And I'm like, okay, what are you going to do when you get to Ghana? Who are you going to be when you get to Ghana? And I met a lot of African Americans there who, they either went one, like they were completely an African now, and they were more African than Africans, or they were very stuck in their Americanness, and not the good parts. So I'm asking, why did you come here? And then I asked those who were really more African than Africans, it looked like a costume almost because it was just overdone. I think they became kind of a caricature. So where is that space? And I think we just haven't had the conversations. I don't think we've had the dialogues. We're underinformed about each other's histories and experiences. We're talking to each other, but not talking across with, this idea of Pan-Africanism is fantastic. And I think there hasn't been this big, open, broad conversation about it. And not that everybody is interested, but I think we have a lot more to do just so that folks can understand. And then also with what you talked about with some of the impacts of colonization and how the borders were all mixed up, it's still displacing. You're still displaced because if you're in a particular ethnic group, but now the new borders are here and there, and then all the voting you described, and it's a mess. It is a mess. So I'll put it very colloquially. And I'm not sure what we can do to resolve it, but I agree with you that it's not a simple concept when we talk about identity or African identity, or there's a lot to it, and it's not all pretty or easy.
Thank you. I have reposted some of the prompts in the chat box. So if you would like to speak to those, please feel free to do that. If you have questions or comments for the presenters and the respondent, again, feel free to do that. Right now, let me take a question here from Barutu Baruti. And this is going to Lekpoh and Marcella. Could you please describe what being a healthy African would look like in the context, environs, and landscape of the United States? What does being a healthy African look like in the US context?
I can start.
Yes, please.
Okay, so as Marcella mentioned, the first thing I will say here is that this is a very complex question and a complex response as well. There are so many dimensions of health, right? Are we talking physical? Are we talking mental health? Are we talking social health? Are we talking just all the different nuances of health, right? And even within those individual categories, if I just focus on mental health, there's a lot I could say about what a healthy individual might look like depending on the culture, the context, and that person's own understanding of what feels healthy, right? Now, when we talk about identity and mental health, I think personally, one space that indicates health is the space to explore our identity. I think that is a sign of health, right? The comfort and feeling like you have access to be able to explore identity, whether it is cultural backgrounds that are important to you and your family and your community. I think really it's about the access to the privilege and the access to move through exploring yourself and your family and your community. Sometimes that's not, even that movement doesn't feel accessible to us, right? It feels like we're born into a path, and we're born into a certain identification, and we're born into spaces that we can't necessarily explore out or move ourselves outside of, right? And when we talk about conflict and identity, I really go back to how ethnicity is so wrapped in a lot of wars, a lot of nation-state conflicts. Dr. Adotey talked about it from the standpoint of borders, and I come to, this concept from my own community where it was ethnic divisions that were used to not only inspire violence, but to maintain violence. And it is ethnic divisions that have really translated to the community outside of Liberia, right? We see 20 years later, folks saying, we don't really know how to talk about what's going on, and to do so in spaces that aren't thoughtful about our history, because everyone resettled to the same area from Liberia. Everyone, and when I say everyone, I mean both survivors and perpetrators of war crimes. And so in Minnesota, you'll see a community of resettled folks that say, okay, I went to the grocery store and I saw somebody who killed my uncle at the grocery store. How am I supposed to heal in community in that context when identity is also wrapped around the conflict, right? And so we see a lot of division. And it's not, I don't want to overemphasize the divisions that's in the community. I think that is part of the history and the culture that has to be understood when we talk about transnational migration from war. But we also know that identity and belongingness can be a source of healing, right? So how do we, in the case of the Liberian community, support a Liberian community as a whole, right? When we talk about community mental health, and not just the health of the Gio people, the health of the Crew people, the health, the health of the city folks. We all are a part of a similar story, and that division is really inspiring less health and less access to be able to explore our own identities and our own health. So I'm rambling. I want to let Marcella go ahead. And I don't know if I responded directly to the question, but those are some thoughts that came up for me.
I don't know that I have anything to add to that question, to that response, because it was specifically around how to be a healthy African in the United States.
Great. Thank you. Again, feel free to post your questions in the question and answer box, or you can put them up as well in the chat box, wherever you feel comfortable. And we also have 3 prompts in the chat box there that we would love to hear from you in your own personal experiences. But for the presenters and even for the respondents, I think a lot of the times that we talk about Ubuntu, we talk about it in a celebratory tone. Where do you find Ubuntu coming or falling short? And what does that mean for the work we want to do, like whether around identity, whether around resettlement and humanizing relationships? Where does Ubuntu fall short? And what can we do about it?
I like that question, and I think I'm in my mind, I'm tying it to the question that Dr. Adotey posed as well, and it made me think about. I was having a conversation in a graduate course while I was in Ghana, and I was asked this question a lot, and it became more and more difficult to answer. Like, do you consider yourself an African? And that has so many layers, and it speaks to what Adotey said earlier. And I remember, saying, when I'm on the continent of Africa, when I'm in South Africa, Ghana, Tunisia, it becomes clear to me that I'm not an African. I thought I was, and I'm not. Because people know that they're like, oh, where are you? You're not from here. Tell us more, whether it's my speech or a gesture or. But I was talking to students about the United States and how, my ancestors are a product of the transatlantic slave trade and a small bit of Native American, and how I felt that I had as much right to claim as much claim to America as any one who had a European heritage who's been in America for centuries. And one student responded to me, she said, but it's not your land. It's not. It's the Native American people's land. It's none of you who are there now, that's not your land. And I said to her, well, where is my land? It's here. Is it here? This is a discrepancy among Africans around who so where do I then fit in? We come back. Okay, we're welcome to come back. Land is a different story. And that was a topic of conversation. So there is this kind of perpetual displacement, this perpetual outsider is the term of, and that can be frustrating. It can be hurtful. But you have to find some way to exist in a healthy way. And to, sometimes you have to construct an identity, and that requires a lot of introspection. So I feel like now I after my time living in Ghana, I felt a little more hyphenated than ever, not necessarily in a bad way, but I had a better understanding. It wasn't just an intellectual understanding or something I'd read, but it was, I was beginning to grasp the nuances and understand that the questions that that Africans had of Black Americans, and some were like, oh, you belong here, but then there are, again, it was very surface, like ours was, like mine was, and to drill down into some of that, it's a little murky. So we talk about Ubuntu, and I think, like with most things are very, kumbaya, until it gets down to resources. So That's all I have to say on that.
I also like this question, and I think Ubuntu falls short in a lot of places in my work, and I really see, I think about the way we think about mental health and the way that we address mental health and how removed it is from traditional and communal cultures as a system. I think we fall short when we, as a part of the system, frame mental health as individual, as only an individual concept or experience. Mental health is absolutely also a product of our relationships and in conversation with our communities and our histories and the people that we're not only around, but that have influence on how we move through identity. Marcella and Edem have both said in many ways that identity is not static, it is a dynamic concept, right? And I also view identity in this way as developmental, in that it changes over time and it's a part of our life cycle. And so in that way, mental health is also dynamic and a part of our life cycle. And so I think it really misses the mark when we only look at it from an intrapsychic, what's inside of me, what's wrong with me perspective. I think Ubuntu falls short when we rely on a provider system that relies on highly trained experts to do this work. I think it really removes a lot of credit and like well-deserved credit from the community when we know that there are folks who might not be trained as a mental health professional, but very much have knowledge of community, knowledge of how parenting works, have good examples of how parenting is successful in this context, or good examples of how couples survive a war after a lot of destruction and events, assaults that heavily impacts our relationships, right? We as highly trained mental health experts or highly trained researchers coming in and leaving communities, not, developing sustainable community-driven solutions to address the problems on the ground. That's how Ubuntu falls short in my work. And so I approach my work from a critical standpoint, really, of just the roots of how we work through mental health and how unfitting it is in a lot of African contexts. But I also think there's a lot of opportunity, even in the way that we're shifting towards more global models of health.
Okay. So for me, in my work, I kind of find it very useful in how I approach the borders, because sometimes people tend to see the borders as physical lines of separation. By using a human-centered approach, I'm looking at how the humans connect to each other across the border. So the border is not necessarily a line of separation, but if you look at it from the cultural perspective, then you understand that, like they say, even in these communities, they call the boundaries an imaginary line. Why would they call it an imaginary line? Because these human relations continue in spite of the fact that it might hold different citizenships as Togolese or Ghanaian. So funerals, festivals, birth rights, all these things, they move across the border each time there's something happening to their families on the other side. And that again also informs the reason why some of them participate in these elections because they think that they belong to both spaces. So for them, colonial boundaries doesn't really. So if once you use a human-centered approach, then you look at the borders differently. What I find Ubuntu wanting is the way it homogenizes experiences. So basically, you talk about African societies and you say that we are very respect, love, all these good things about societies. But in these same societies, you have people who are marginalized. So if you live in a society that is democratic or very patriarchal, people have their own issues. We have societies where some were slaves or servants or whatever you want to call it. So people's experiences are not the same, but it seems to romanticize the African experience and says that we're all living happily and everybody was nice to each other and all that. And I don't think that is the idea. So even when I look at the borders, I try to look at the nuances. So the same way some people are saying that the border is an imaginary line, some are also saying that it exists. And for them, they are Ghanaians or they are Togolese. They don't see that cross-border connection. So mine is to tease out these nuances and see the differences that lie in there because people's experiences are never the same. And I think besides not historizing these experiences because they are not static, I think the other thing is that it basically homogenizes experiences within societies that are usually basically glosses over some of these differences and we need to tease out some of these differences.
Thank you. We have another set of questions here and I will go through and read them out for you. How do we use identity construction as a unifying force instead of as a dividing force? Can Ubuntu be used to engage the identity question? The other question we have here was directed to Marcella, but I would like to get all the presenters and the respondent to take it up as well. Why is Blackness not perceived as Africanness in the United States? Or is it? Do you see yourself as an African? But I do want to ask Dr. Adotey and Dr. Dwanyen to respond to that as well. I know that like you spoke about yourself as an African earlier on. What does that mean to be an African for you in the context in which you find yourself, and the same thing to Dr. Adotey. So let's take those ones up. And thank you guys for the questions. Feel free to post some more.
Okay, I'll start. I think the question was, why is Blackness not seen as African in the United States? And among some Black people, it is. And there's not a one prevalent thought about it, to be honest. You can ask 10 different Black people, getting 10 different answers. You know, you have, and again, when I say Black Americans, and I have to use that term because when I say African Americans, you know, that's now very loaded. You have people who are from the Caribbean or Central and South America, or, you know, just all over the place. And now there's this whole descendants of slaves, you know, designation. So people are thinking more about how they arrived in those conditions. And part of it is because Blackness in America is seen, it's vilified. It's the very bad stereotype of, you know, criminals, drug dealers, and promiscuity, dependent on the government, all that kind of thing. So a lot of people Blacks who are coming to the US who are not descendants of slaves or even later generations, are kind of like, I'm not those Black people. I'm a Black person from this, you know. So so that's one piece. That's one side of it. But then even amongst in general, for some of us it is. For some of us, that African American, the African piece is very important because we want to acknowledge it. We know that's the root of it. We know that's the problem piece of it. We know that's the unresolved. That's what's unresolved in our in our political landscape. We know it's the root of everything else around race in this country, you know. But then other people are interested in having some distance from it because of the ramifications of being Black, and just disassociate themselves from Africa in general, because they say, oh, I've never been there, or there's nothing, you know, and they've held on to this idea of Africa as barbaric and less than, and you know, everything negative. So there is a broad swath of opinion, a very broad spectrum. So it can be generalized. I mean, I can't generalize to answer, you know, this is why, because people have a variance of feelings about it.
Thanks, Marcella. Just to pick up where you left off, the first thing I thought when I heard the question was, why is Blackness not perceived as Africanness in the US? The first thing I thought was, it is. But that's also coming from, that's my view of Blackness. And I think Blackness is diasporic. I think that Blackness encompasses all of us in the world who derived from Africa or the Caribbean. I do know that everybody has to navigate their own relationship with both Blackness and Africanness, right? Regardless of where that relationship starts, and including, you know, many of us that are born in Africa and resettle to the US or, you know, other lands. It takes a reconfrontation and a re-navigation of that relationship, because like we've mentioned, identity is dynamic. And when you come to the US and, you know, the language, foods, culture, you know, how you hear everyone speak, what folks are wearing, you know, you're repositioned in a place where you're now more conscious of your Black skin, your hair, your food, your voice. It takes a reconfrontation with who am I and who am I in this space in relation to folks around me, the rules spoken and unspoken around me. So yeah, I think that all these elements are part of how we navigate our relationship with both Blackness and Africanness. I was just thinking, I was actually just at a class last week, and the recent census, like 2019, showed that actually the top 2 receiving countries for Black immigrants in the US in the last 20 years was Jamaica and I believe Jamaica, and I'll have to look, but the top 2 receiving countries were Caribbean. We're in the Caribbean region. And so the 3rd and the 4th were Ethiopia and Nigeria. So we have a lot of Black immigrants that are resettling to the US. And actually in the last 20 years, those numbers have significantly increased, but we're coming from everywhere. We're coming from Africa and we're coming from the Caribbean as well. And so folks are navigating their journeys to the US. And I wouldn't say that Blackness is not Africanness in the US. I think there are a lot of folks who believe and live in you know, in the borderlands of those spaces. But I also believe that not everybody does, and it is an individual relationship. Yeah.
Can I add something? I took a look at the question. I realized I didn't answer the last part of the question, and it was, do you consider yourself African? And the answer to that is yes, I do. And I also consider myself American. I have to embrace that hyphen because, you know, before I ever visited the continent of Africa, there were things about my family, my culture, our practices that were very, very unique. And, you know, America never lets you forget it. Okay, America does not let you forget it. And it was a choice on how to embrace it. So upon making some friendships with people from West Africa in particular, there are things that were pointed out to me, like, you haven't, where are your family, where are your parents from? No, where are your grandparents? Somebody's African in your family. I'm like, I don't know. Well, my parents are rural Southerners on the coast of South Carolina, and they lived in an area that really kind of retained a lot of things. And in marrying my husband, there are things that I do. There are things that my father does that he says, oh my goodness, your father belongs, and he said he belongs in the village on such and such, you know, he kind of runs it down. And my dad's, you know, propensity for attending funerals. He's also 85. So, you know, that's what you do. You know, when my husband visited my parents' home in the rural South Carolina for the first time, he said, this is the village. You know, there are people on the side of the road selling boiled peanuts and watermelon, people sitting on the porch, you know, rocking on the chair and waving to you as you pass by. And he said, oh my goodness, we have to get some land down here. He said, this is, and when my mom cooks certain things, she and my husband compare a lot of recipes. We call it something here. And my husband says, we call it that. And it's the same, maybe one or two different substituted ingredients, but he's like, oh, we call it this, we call it that. So there are things like that, you know, tie and connect us. So yeah, in those ways, of course, you know, I do. And then my husband will point out things that I do around the house. He's like, oh my goodness. But beyond that, there are pictures. I look a lot like my husband's mother. I have an uncle who could be the son of his grandfather. They look so much alike. And pictures I saw of a friend, she was from Togo. I met her in graduate school. And she showed me pictures of her grandmother, and they looked like the pictures of my grandmother. So these are kind of the undeniable like ways women dressed or carry themselves, and then the food ways and folk ways that that tie us, that connected us. And as far as being an American, I mean, I was born here. This is I grew up in a different place, and there are those things I can't strip away from who I am. So yes, I consider myself African, but I also consider myself an American, and I don't necessarily see those always in conflict, of course, sometimes, but not always.
Okay, that's a very interesting question. It's a question we always pose to our undergrad students in African studies, who is an African, and it's not an easy one to grapple with. So are you using race? Are you using the geographical space of the continent? What is it that makes you an African? Because even if we're going to be using the continent of Africa, what about the islands that belong to Portugal, France, and all that, who call themselves Europeans? What happens to the geographical space? So it's a very complex thing. And as much as you know, on the continent of Africa, it's everybody who is Black. So yes, Blackness could be a subset of being African, but it couldn't, on the continent, at least speaking from the perspective of the continent, it can't fully replace everybody on the continent because we have different groups. If we're going to be using the fiction of race and all that, you have different people here. You have the whites, you have the Blacks, you have the Arabs. So being African, it's a bit more complex when it comes to the continent. So you have white South Africans who call themselves Africans. You have white Zimbabweans who call themselves Africans. You have Arabs from North Africa who call themselves Africans. You have Blacks from West East who call themselves Africans. So it's not an easy thing to say Blackness equal to African or whatever. So it's a very complex one. It's a mix of several things. So yes, you're Black and African, and it could be white, and it could also be an African. So that's the way it is.
Yes, maybe we want to take a minute each here to respond to the other question, which says, how do we use identity construction as a unifying force instead of a dividing force. Because I do think in our remarks, the presenters, we might be talking about something that identifies us with a certain group, but does that identifying mark separate us from others? In other words, how do we, I'm thinking here about building bridges. How do we use identity construction as a unifying force to build bridges across rather than to separate us into certain categories?
It's a really good question. And I'm thinking through it. You know, I think about in my work, I work a lot with parents and caregivers and who might be looking for ways to support children develop a healthy sense of self, a healthy individual and social development, right? And we see a lot more around socialization work and how Black parents and caregivers are really charged with these additional tasks of not just parenting and caregiving and, you know, committing to the complex nuances of that task. But it involves extra layers of, you know, learning and teaching our children how to love our hair, how to love our skin, how to love our voice and the way we speak, how to teach our children how to respond to racism and to discrimination. And I think that that involves a level of understanding and awareness of even how to navigate those things ourselves before supporting children in doing it. But I think about spaces that would offer us a chance to just storytell, right? And talk about what we're experiencing in community and how, you know, for example, being in, I'll take the example of Liberians, which is it's in some ways a divider, but not as much as the division of 16 different ethnicities that, you know, kind of inspires some of the community dynamics now, right? So my thought is, how do we create storytelling spaces that could honor what we've been through, regardless of how, you know, what ethnicity or what ethnic group we're a part of, or what individual histories we come from, so that we can just acknowledge that we are hurting as a group, right? Or we can heal as a group. I think storytelling and just offerings, you know, spaces that aren't necessarily medicalized for my work, medicalized, formalized in these, you know, really rigid structures. The more we lean into cultural narratives and wisdoms, how we know that we've achieved, you know, health and healing before without somebody coming in and inserting whatever inserts helped build the structure around mental health. I think that the traditional knowledges and wisdoms that even we see in Liberia are not unique, right? They are very much mirrored the strengths in the ways that other communities approach mental health when we're not involving us expert providers, right? And so I think about how my work with Ugandans and Liberians are really, really similar. But not only that, my work with Liberians and Ugandans and people, Karen people who come from Thailand and Myanmar right now, right? Southeast Asia. traditional healings and wisdoms and knowledges that folks have used for centuries to achieve health looks very similar across communities, across continents as well. And so I think there's a lot of space to you know, allow identity to be a unifying force and our histories to be a unifying force, even in the mental health world. But we have to change the way that we're doing things and stop relying on systems that aren't necessarily starting with community and starting with our knowledge.
So thank you. Before we come back to Marcella and Dr. Adotey, Amanda, I see that you would like to speak, so I'm going to unmute you and allow you to talk so that we can take your comment. Amanda, please go ahead. Amanda, if you are not ready right now, I'll go to, there's a comment from Baruti. I'm not sure if Baruti would like to speak as well. I think sometimes things might come out clearer if you could, if you are comfortable doing that, I would give you a moment to speak here if you would like to. If not, we can go back to the panelists.
I think they are still muted. Maybe that's why we can hear them. Okay, Bart is muted.
Hello, good morning to everyone. Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, thank you very much. Enjoy having the opportunity to engage with the group today. I had a comment, and I'll read it. It might be on the screen that you can see it, but maybe as Dr. McCoy-Deh said, it might come out a little bit more clearly by me articulating it audio-wise. So I noticed that the term Black American, or BA, is being used more and more prevalently now. Newspapers, amongst news pundits, particularly white news pundits in general. And in the 1980s, various people like Reverend Jesse Jackson and other thinkers had promoted the use of the term African American to essentially transition from the term Black in certain ways, not to abandon it, but to transition or expand the term Black to give Black people in the United States primarily a land-based anchorage in Africa from a historical point of view. This would round out more ideas about cultural development and, you know, expanded thought. But it seems like today that the term Black American is being used kind of like almost, in my view, a retreat against the term African American. Seems like a regression rather than something that is uplift, something against being like a healthy African, as I had alluded in a prior question. So it seems like that the term Black American is now a new term that is couched in language from these ADOS groups, these nativist groups that eschew Africanness, Afrocentricity, Pan-African leanings. Could you all give me some insight on this based upon what we're seeing? By the way, I want to point out, just on information that I had kind of read, it seems as though when the term African American was brought about, reading some news articles from that time period, a number of white or European people in the United States at first didn't like the term. They thought that Black should be it. They definitely didn't want the Black people to identify themselves as African, and always jumped at the chance to not use the term African. And perhaps we see that today in the usage now of the term Black American, of which there's so much fervor to use this and to abandon African American. And why is this term controversial at this point when everybody knew what African American meant? Why do people not know what it means now in the United States? So let me ask that question and see what people have to say. Thank you for your time, by the way.
Thank you so much, Adotey. And before we go to the panelists, I'm looking at my clock, so I'll take all the remaining questions here so that when you respond, we can wrap them up in just one cycle. Amanda, coming back to you, are you still there and would you like to speak? I unmuted you from my end. Would you like to go ahead? If not, maybe you could put your question in the chat box, whether it's a comment or question. Feel free to do that. I'm going to go to the panelists. We have 10 minutes and we want to end on time. So I'll give each of you maybe a minute each to respond. I know there's a lot to unpack, but let's try to do this so that we can come back to your closing remarks.
I'll start. Thank you for your questions, the last two speakers. I'll start with the previous question and around unifying approach, I believe. And I think there are a couple of ways we can, just some things that I do. I'll just speak for myself. There are this phenomena going around in the US called, one is, it's Black Girl Magic, Black Boy Joy, and the celebration and acknowledgement of Black joy. And I think that's really important. So working on a college campus, when I see young women doing interesting things with their hair, their outfits, and they're young, they're finding ways to express themselves. We might be in the ladies' room, we might be in passing, and I say something affirmative, like, I see you, or, oh, I see what you're doing. I like that. Okay, I see your Black Girl Magic. It's popping, something to affirm who they are and how they're trying to express themselves in white spaces. That's the one thing. The other piece is I use, in response to Leki's thought about stories, telling stories. In the classroom, I try to use African literature as a way to, in some cases, introduce, in other cases, to talk and just get at some of the nuances. Because, again, anything dealing with Africa is not completely absent, but very deficient in our curricula, in general, in American curricula. So if I'm teaching a course on culture, or I'm teaching a course on, global, fill in the blank, I like to use classical and contemporary African literature, because when reading fiction, it's a way for people to enter the lives and the minds and the hearts of the character, the storyteller, and the things they see as differences fall off, and they get enwrapped in the story and they attach themselves that way. And then from there, we talk about the issues. So that's been my approach over many years, particularly when I'm working at a predominantly white institution, because as a Black instructor in a white classroom, my priority is that students get it. I don't want to be the barrier, because they might have issues about me as the authority figure in the classroom, me as the expert. So we deal from the literature. That's what we're. Oh boy, have I been muted all this time?
No, we lost you just for a little bit.
Oh, okay. So yeah, and then for Baruti, thank you for your comment and question, and thank you for I've kind of lost track of this. I have observed, you're correct, that there's this move to Black American, and my understanding of it was, that it was supposed to be, a return to Black as a political term, and to be something that's more inclusive. but I use both. I don't see anything wrong with African American, and I absolutely understand that it is to use that term as an affront to some folks, but that is who we are. So I don't have a problem with using that term. And I haven't quite unpacked other than what I've mentioned earlier, the preference by Black people for the term Black Americans as opposed to African Americans. I am aware that there are some, for example, if you have white South Africans who are here and say, well, I'm an African American, and maybe they can say that if they go back to South Africa, but that doesn't have any currency in the United States because it just means something different contextually here. So I embrace them both because for me, the African American term is a heritage, lineage statement. The Black American term is a kind of more of a political label for me, because Blackness in America is a problem. And so, I see them both as powerful statements, but I also acknowledge your comments, your background on it.
Thank you, Marcella. We have 5 minutes. Lekpoh, would you like to take a minute, and then Dr. Adotey do the same thing, and then we should be closing in a few minutes.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say, echoing Marcella's sentiments here at the end and some of what we touched on earlier, I do think there's some nuance in the labels or the resonance with Black American versus African American. And I think in many instances, it depends on where we're situating the identity. Is it to reflect, heritage and African heritage, or is it, I typically, use Black American when I am referring to the diaspora, or broadly speaking about Blackness, because Blackness exists everywhere. And so I don't necessarily feel a distance from either term, and I think it really would again, depend on the relationship to both. I do also recall conversations where folks have maybe felt a political correctedness in the term African American, and so preferred Black American personally, as a more comfortable approach and a more direct approach to just the global connectedness to our Blackness. And so I do think that there's reason and there is purpose in both terms. And like you mentioned, Baruti, there certainly there's a geographical and a geopolitical rationale involved in African American and Black American as both an identity. And I think that we just kind of have to realize what we're holding when we are using the term and what we're distancing ourselves away from. But I don't think it's consistent across the board.
Well, personally, as someone who's never experienced what African American experiences in the US, it's difficult for me to choose Black or African. But personally, I prefer African because then it speaks to a particular land base and it's easier to identify with a space that I'm comfortable with rather than a color. So that is my personal preference.
Okay, thank you so much. We want to say thank you to Marcella, to Lekpoh, to Dr. Adotey for joining us for this conversation, and for all of us who are also here. We would like to direct you again to our Ubuntu Dialogues website to check on upcoming events. We do have another set of webinars. Hopefully, as things open up, we can do more things in person, but we have that information on our website. We would like to invite you to join us there as well. And if you have any interesting and exciting events in your organizations, please let us know so that we can be part of that engagement as well. We do like to create a community of practitioners, of academics in the work that we do, and please do share that information. We can share it with our networks as well, but we also really want to participate in the activities and programs you are doing. And lastly, I want to say thank you to Andy. She was working in the background to make this work. Very appreciative of your presence and your support. We look forward to connecting one way or the other soon, and we hope that you have a very wonderful rest of the semester to everyone. And then look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.